Are you tired of shooting in auto mode and do you want to take your photography to the next level? Well, stick around as we break down the camera modes that you need to understand to take control of your camera and start taking pictures that you can be proud of. I'll help you to stop being a passenger in your photography and start driving your camera, and stick around until the end where I'll give you my best top tip to learning the exposure modes for any beginner photographer. My name's Steve and welcome to Behind the Tripod. Let's get looking at exposure modes in photography. But before we start exploring all the different exposure modes on your camera, I just want to quickly look at the mode we all begin with. Yep, we're going to look at the auto mode. You see, the auto mode is the easiest and by far the least scary mode on your camera. You just point the camera at something, focus and press the shutter button, and through some very clever technical wizardry, your camera decides on the best exposure and makes all the adjustment settings for you. Now, there are certainly some benefits to the auto mode for beginner photographers, the main one being its ease of use, particularly when you're facing that steep learning curve that all beginner photographers are faced with. But that's what Behind the Tripod is here for, so hopefully as you watch my videos, that steep learning curve should start to flatten a bit and seem at least a little bit less scary. So if you're new to photography, please remember to subscribe to this channel. But I digress. When you start photography, it can be difficult to know where to begin. Should you start with the exposure triangle? Should you learn composition? Should you invest in this piece of equipment or that piece of kit first? There are so many questions, and there isn't, unfortunately, one right answer for everyone. So if you're in the camp that would like to learn something like composition first, then having your camera set on auto mode is probably the best option for you, as you can focus purely on the art of composition, of framing your shots without worrying about wrapping your head around the exposure triangle. However, if you always shoot in auto mode and never move on, you'll never really reach your full potential as a photographer, and you'll never get the most out of all that technology and the clever stuff that goes on inside your camera and lens. You see, when you shoot in auto, you're giving the camera the full control over the exposure settings and allowing it to make all of the decisions around depth of field, around motion blur, and around the grain, or as we photographers like to call it, control over the exposure triangle. Now, I have a full video on demystifying the exposure triangle, which I've linked to either above or below or wherever it is for you at the moment. But for the sake of this video, here's a quick refresher in under 1 minute. So first, what do we actually mean by exposure? When you press the shutter button on your camera, light spills into the camera body, hitting the sensor. Exposure describes how much light interacts with the sensor. So when we think about exposure, there are really only three things you need to understand: apertures, shutter speed, and ISO. And these three settings all work together to correctly expose an image, with the aperture controlling how much light enters the camera through a movable diaphragm within the lens. Think of it like the pupil of your eye, and it's a bit similar to this. The shutter speed, on the other hand, acts like a pair of curtains. They stay closed until you hit the shutter button, then they're open for a period of time before being closed again, and the amount of time they're kept open is what you call shutter speed. And finally, ISO refers to how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is, and the lower the ISO, the less sensitive it is. In these three settings work together to allow just the right amount of light into the camera and onto the sensor, and the sensor is either more or less sensitive to the light, and this is called the exposure triangle, as it's a nice way to visualize how these elements all work together. But there's more to it than that. Apertures also affect depth of field, with wide apertures producing less depth of field and narrow apertures giving more. Shutter speeds control motion blur, and the ISO controls digital noise, with higher ISOs giving increasingly noisy images. So now that we've established the elements of the exposure triangle, let's look at our first camera mode, which is usually shown as the letter P, which stands for program mode. Now, program mode is often the first of the semi-automatic settings that new photographers try out, and for good reason. You see, it seems simple, it looks easy to understand, and it feels like a pretty good place to start learning about the exposure triangle. Basically, P allows you to make changes to one side of the exposure triangle, and the camera will take care of the rest. However, I've got to be honest, I'm not a fan of the P mode. I find it quite clunky, and I don't think it's all that helpful when it comes to learning the exposure triangle. So what other options do you have? Well, this moves us nicely onto the two priority modes that I am a big fan of. These are called Aperture Priority mode, which is usually shown as either an A or an AV on the camera, and Shutter Priority mode, which is usually shown as either an S or TV. When shooting in either of these modes, you select the exposure based on either the aperture or the shutter speed, and the camera changes the effect on the other two sides of the exposure triangle to make sure that you get a good exposure. One practical thing of note is that if you use either of these priority modes, please make sure your ISO is set to auto ISO, otherwise your camera will likely struggle to get the best exposure. If you Google how to set your ISO to auto on your particular camera, I'm sure you'll find a blog article or some videos that can help you out. So let me now give you an example of how to use one of these priority modes. If you say wanted to shoot a portrait outside with a blurry background, you would need a wide aperture. So in this example, you'd need to select the Aperture Priority mode and choose a low f number, because remember that the lower the f number, the wider the aperture. The camera now would then choose the appropriate shutter speed and ISO settings to get a good exposure for this image. Let's look at some other examples. In this image, I used a high shutter speed and shutter priority. This allowed me to keep the cyclist sharp while I tracked the shot. On the other hand, in this image, I used a very slow shutter speed in shutter priority so that the water would smooth out, creating a lovely ethereal effect. In this one, I used aperture priority with a narrow aperture to give lots of depth of field, whereas in this image I achieved the opposite with a nice sharp subject and a soft background that we photographers call bokeh. So as you can see, aperture and shutter priority modes allow you to start taking control of your camera and are probably the best way to start learning about the exposure triangle. There are some drawbacks to using the priority modes, mostly due to the camera not always selecting the correct exposure for you, but there is a workaround for this in something called exposure compensation, which I'll cover in a future video, so remember to subscribe so you don't miss it. Another thing to watch in aperture priority mode is your shutter speed. If you're shooting handheld, keep an eye on your shutter, as the camera may select a shutter speed that's too slow for handheld shots, and this will make your images soft or blurry and potentially wreck your image. But there are also some situations where priority modes have a distinct advantage over the fully manual mode. A great example of this is when shooting very quickly in very changeable lighting conditions, such as shooting in a sports match where half the pitch is in shadow and half is in light, and the players are constantly moving from the shadow to the light. Or in a landscape shoot at sunrise or sunset where the light is changing very fast. However, I believe that every photographer should strive to eventually learn how to shoot in fully manual mode, which is shown as an M on your camera. In this mode, you have full control over all of your exposure settings. Yes, there are still some situations where I shoot in priority modes, but these are incredibly rare these days. So let me explain why I think that all photographers should be working towards understanding the manual mode. You see, if you learn to shoot in manual mode, you will be learning at a very deep level how light affects your exposure and your composition. Now, I can promise that you'll definitely make mistakes along the way, but you'll also learn so much from these mistakes, and your understanding of light, of exposure, and how to use the exposure triangle to really get the images that you want will be so much better for it. And once you've mastered manual mode, you can then make really informed choices about how you want to shoot. You see, some people prefer to shoot in one of the priority modes for the majority of their photography, and that just works wonderfully for them. I've met some amazing photographers who shoot solely in priority modes, but these photographers have chosen to use the priority modes not because they're afraid of manual mode, but because it suits their workflow. For my workflow, I usually choose to shoot in manual mode, not for 1 second because I think I'm better than other photographers who use priority modes, but because, to be honest, I learned to shoot in manual mode years ago and I actually find it easier. Because for me, in the way that I work, I find it more intuitive and a lot less faffy than the priority modes. You see, I know that in manual mode, I won't need to mess around with the exposure compensation to get the exposure that I want. And I also know that the camera won't inadvertently change a setting, like slowing down the shutter speed when I'm shooting handheld, which could absolutely wreck my image. In a situation like this, if the light changes and I'm happy with my aperture and shutter settings, I would probably just go to the ISO and boost it. You see, I've got full control over the camera settings, and for me, it's one less thing to worry about. However, shooting manually in this way does take a lot of practice and a lot of failed shots. So do I recommend that you go from auto straight into the manual mode? No, absolutely not. If you're starting out, trying to go straight to manual mode will cause you nothing but frustration. So what do I suggest instead? Well, I promised you a top tip when it comes to learning exposure, and here it is. If you're currently shooting in auto mode, I recommend that you skip the P mode entirely and start experimenting with the priority modes as soon as possible. The key word here being experimenting. I want you to think about what effect you want to get, such as a blurry background, which would be an aperture priority with a low f number, or a sharp moving subject, so shutter priority with a high shutter speed. But play with your camera settings and see what different shutter and aperture settings do to your image. So there you go, my thoughts on the exposure modes, but how do you shoot? Do you use the P mode or the priority modes, and what are your experiences of shooting in manual? Please let me know in the comments below, and please share how you get on with the different modes. I read all the comments and I love hearing from you, and if you'd like to share your images with a group of friendly and supportive photographers, then please consider joining our Facebook group. And if you'd like to learn more about getting the best from your camera, you could watch this video up here, where I dive deep into the murky waters of focal lengths.